Hello and welcome to this first movie of our Dice Creator Pack, which gives you an overview of the different dice, the skins and the basic functionality contained within this pack. In the next videos we'll go into the actual construction of a scene like this, the construction of a die, how you can create textures for these dice yourself, multi-value dice and much more. But before we do that, let us first have a look at the provided getting started scene. So I already went ahead, I searched for Dice Creator Pack, downloaded it, imported it into our scene, and after that I went into the Inner Drive Studios Dice Creator Scenes folder and I opened up the Getting Started scene. As we open up the scene, we are presented with this preview of all the dice that are in the package. We have a D2, we have a D4, we have two versions of a D6, one that has harder edges and one that has rounded edges. We have a D8, three versions of a D10, one D10 that goes from 0 up to 9, one D10 that goes from 1 up to 9 and has this X value that you can use as either 0 or 10. We have a 10 based D10 which has values like 10, 20, 30, etc. We have a D12 and last but not least we have this D20. As you might already have noticed, if we select a die you see this whole jumble of numbers pop up. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, we see these are actually the normals combined with the values for a given die. In case you are not familiar with the term normal, it basically indicates which way that sign is pointing, and we use that info to determine which side is currently up. Anyway, we can also hide them for now by going over here on the gizmos and deselecting this checkbox for the die sides. On the right, we can see a die is made up of several components. Of course, we have the usual suspects, so as a transform component, a mesh filter, a mesh renderer, but also a collider and a rigid body, since all these demo dies are physics based. Note that they don't have to be. You can use all these dies and the provided scripts any way you please, but the dies in the provided demo scene are all physics based. Below that it gets interesting because we have the die size component, which is actually responsible for generating all those side normals I mentioned before and storing that data that corresponds with all those sides. For example, if we zoom in on the die again, we see that side 0 is linked to value 5, and if we go over here we can change this value and we see it update in the scene in real time. But let's put this back to 5 because we'll skip the details for now and we'll get into that in another movie. So below the die size component we have this physics die script which determines how the die is actually rolled. We have a physics die avoider script which makes sure the dice don't stick to walls or other dice, and we have a mouse click die roller script which allows us to actually trigger a roll of the die by, as the name implies, just clicking the die with the mouse. Moving on, we see all dice are visually located on this box called the rolling area. You see they are not children of it, they are just located on the area in the scene, and the rolling area itself contains a floor, a top, and also back, front, left and right sides, and you see the collider for those sides is much bigger than the actual visual representation of that. And what you can also see is that some of these elements, especially the sides, also have this physics die avoider script. That is to make sure that the dice don't stick into the wall. Zooming in a little bit, we see that each die has this little interface above its head called the Die To Debug Ui, which provides us information about the die both in the editor and also at runtime. So even though we are not playing, we're in editor mode, we see that this die has 6 sides, and we also see that the closest match is the number 5, and that is also considered to be an exact match. So basically we are not leaning into anything. There's no discussion about the value of this die. And currently we are not rolling. And if we grab this die, we can also see that if we move it up a little bit and rotate it around, that while we are rotating it, that the value actually updates. To reset it, we can just click on place on ground over here and just see it being put back to an exact value and also being aligned with the floor again. Now all these little debug UIs are located under this world debug UIs node. You don't have to do it like that, but I like to do it like that because it allows you to quickly enable and disable all debug UIs at once. Connecting a die to a debug UI is also very simple. You just select the Die Debug UI and you drag in a die to this die size field. Next up, we have these two collection nodes, this D100 collection node and this die collection node, which, as the name implies, allows you to sort of configure a logical collection of dies. For example, the D100 is a really small collection which only contains the 0 to 9 base D10 and the 100 base D10, which together forms a D100 as you might know it from Rollmaster or a game like Dungeons & Dragons. On the other hand, we also have a little bit bigger collection, this die collection over here, which contains all dies and also the D100. And this collection, as we'll see in a minute, allows us to basically track a set of dies as a whole and also roll a set of dies as a whole. So moving on, we have this main debug UI. And if we dig a little bit deeper, ignoring the nodes that are just there for layout purposes, we see that this main debug UI consists of 3 additional panels. First of all, we have the Die Collection Debug UI, which, as the name implies, allows us to track all the dies in a specific collection. It allows us to throw all the dies, clear the results, maybe rethrow some dies that maybe ended up into a wall. It shows you the number of dies in the collection, whether any are rolling, what the total value is, and while running will also show you information about all the separate dies in here. In order to be able to do its work, it also needs a reference, of course, to a die collection, which you can find over here. And the same for the Material Manager UI. This allows us to change the material of a set of dies while playing. And that also requires a reference to the same die collection, which you can find over there. Last but not least, we have this little panel called the Activation Utility panel. And at runtime, it will provide you with some information on how you can enable or disable all these panels. Enough said. Let's play the scene and see how this all works in practice. I started the scene in maximized mode, so we have plenty of screen space. And we'll start with this panel in the left bottom, which allows you to toggle all the other panels by just pressing the key that's mentioned over here. So if we press 1, we disable the Die Collection UI. Pressing it again brings it back. If we press 2, we can hide or show the Material Manager. If we press 3, we can enable or disable the panel itself, and if we press 4, we can actually enable or disable all the mini debug UIs. Just a moment to show you how that works. Basically, on this node, on the main debug UI, we have this activation utility script, and in there we have some activation items. We can set how many activation items we have, in this case 4, and the Die Collection Debug UI is the first, linked to the 1 key, and when you press 1, it should enable or disable these objects. And the same for the Material Manager, the menu itself, and the Die Debug UIs. You can also enable or disable multiple game objects at the same time, but it's just a simple utility to allow you to get the most out of your screen space. So let's go back into play mode. So we have all the dies over here. I can click a die, which will cause it to be thrown. And you can see while I'm rolling it, the exact match value in the debug UI turns blue, and then when it lands on the floor and stops rolling, it becomes green again. You can also see, if you pay attention to, for example, this is rolling value over there, that once I trigger the die, that you see the is rolling becomes true, and then when it ends, you see it turns false, and you also see the events that are being thrown by the die and the closest match, etc. We can also zoom in on a die by right clicking, so you can have a closer look. This is done by a simple script that's located on the camera. And of course, we can also throw all the dice at once by clicking on this throw all button. Before I do so, however, note that for the dice that are already rolled, the value has turned green already. I can clear all those values again by clicking over there. So of course, all the dice still have that value, but it's sort of being flagged as a reset. So I can press throw all. You see all the 11 dice are being thrown. Are any rolling? Yes. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, etc. Dice are still rolling. As the dice come to a stop, you see all these values turn green. And you also see the total value of that you would get if you would add all these values together. What you might have noticed is that when I click throw all, that these values over here, such as die total and all these values over here, they get an asterisk value, which basically indicates, hey, I'm still rolling. If you do want to have live updates, you can also check this one, always update, and then you can see when you press throw all that the whole collection and all the dice are being updated in real time. It's a little bit more processor intensive because normally when you don't do that, the results will be cached, but as you can see, it works just fine. So moving on, we have this material manager, and opening the drop down, I can choose a different material set, which is basically being applied in real time. The first time you do that, it takes a little bit of time because the materials are being loaded, but after that, you can just select another set, and all the dies are being updated to use a material from that set. To show you a little bit on how that's done, basically here in the materials folder we have this material sets, and these material sets contain a bunch of materials that are matching with all the dies. And these are a part of this die material set collection again. So all the materials go into these material sets, and all the material sets go into a die material set collection. And this die material set collection is also being used by this material manager UI, which you can see over there. So that brings us to the end of this getting started movie. I hope you enjoyed it, and maybe see you in the next one.